Hello and welcome, realtors. It's hard to believe, but we're well into the second half of the year, and it's time for our mid-year market update. I hope the first half of the year has been fantastic for you, although we've seen signs of the market normalizing. The newspapers and the media have characterized it as more of a slump, looking at some short-term trends. But where is the market going, and are there signs of a recession or other negative consequences out there that we need to be aware of? Well, to help us answer these questions today, we have a special guest. Dr. Joey von Nessen is no stranger to the realtor family. He is a research economist, as many of you already know, in the Division of Research at the Darla Moore School of Business, where he specializes in regional economics, regional economic forecasting, and housing economics. He regularly conducts a wide variety of economic impact analyses, feasibility studies, and independent market research for clients in both the private and public sector. In addition, he's responsible for the preparation and presentation of the University of South Carolina's annual statewide economic forecast. And he serves on the advisory committee for the South Carolina Board of Economic Advisors and is regularly invited to brief the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond on economic conditions in South Carolina. He's a frequent speaker for business and government leaders. And as I mentioned, he's no stranger to our realtor family, as he is a frequent speaker for our association as well. He also makes frequent media appearances to various local I lost my place. Sorry, Joy. He also makes frequent media appearances to discuss various local economic topics of interest. Dr. Joey von Nessen earned his BA at Furman University and his PhD in economics at the University of South Carolina. We are just a couple of housekeeping things. We're going to be taking questions. Please, realtors, post your questions in the webinar chat. And at the end of Joy's presentation, we will have a few minutes to answer as many of those questions as possible. So in the meantime, please help me give a warm realtor welcome to Dr. Joey von Nessen. Joey, welcome.
Well, thank you, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction. And before I get started, let me pause for just a moment and share my screen. So we'll make sure that that works okay. And so, Nick, I will ask you if you can see that. And if you can, I assume everyone else can as well.
Yes, sir. You are good to go.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, once again. And Nick, thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to see everybody today. And again, my name is Joey von Nessen. I am a research economist with the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. And we primarily focus on applied economic research. And one term I like to use to really encapsulate the work that we do is so what economics. Many of you have heard me use that term before, but I like it because it really encapsulates the type of analysis that we do, looking at economic data and always asking the question, so what? How can we use economic data to help organizations make strategic decisions? When we look at economic data, we want to ask that question, so what? How do these data apply? How can they help businesses and organizations make good strategic decisions? So anytime you're looking to make a strategic decision in your business, obviously the first thing you have to understand is the economic landscape that you find yourself in. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Where we are in July of 2023, as Nick alluded to, already the housing market has seen some dramatic changes over the past year, and especially in the first half of 2023. And so we want to get an assessment of where we are market-wide, looking at the economy as a whole, at the housing market in particular, how we got here, and what that tells us about where we're likely to see the economy go in the second half of 2023 and into 2024. So that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, looking back, looking at where we are, and then looking forward. So as we get started then and think about where the economy is in July of 2023, I think a good way to frame the discussion and to think about the economy as a whole as the year of readjustment, 2023 being the year of readjustment. Now, what does that mean? It simply means that we've been in a period since the pandemic began where demand has been far outpacing supply. This has been happening market-wide. It has been happening especially in the housing market. And so we've been very much at a disequilibrium point, demand far outpacing supply consistently over the last several years. And that's had a number of consequences that we're going to go through in detail. But the main consequence, of course, is when demand is higher than supply, we see upward pressure on prices. And that translates, or that's really the definition of inflation, of higher inflation. And so that has emerged over the last year. And that's why the Federal Reserve has had to be proactive in raising interest rates to get inflation back under control. So that readjustment process that the Fed has really been spearheading is what we've been seeing in 2023. We've seen significant progress on the inflation front. And that begs the question, as we move into the second half of the year, is this readjustment period basically over? And are we back to pre-pandemic norms? And the short answer to that question is no, we are not there yet. We have made meaningful progress. We're definitely moving in the right direction. And in general, we're more optimistic today about a soft landing and that we can avoid recession than we were 6 months ago. But it's important to remember that we are not there yet. We're still very much in this transition period, this readjustment. And so that theme that has permeated the first half of 2023 will continue to be with us for the second half of the year. So let's spend some time talking about that and how we got where we are and what that implies for the readjustment for the second half of 2023, particularly in the housing market. And the way to start is to first ask the question, how did we get in this position where we needed to readjust, the economy being so much out of alignment between supply and demand? And if we go back, we can look at two major factors that really generated this high level of demand that we've been seeing over the past several years, which you can see here are a very rapid labor market recovery following the recession in 2020, and then $6 trillion in federal stimulus. We saw multiple stimulus packages that put consumers and households in a very good financial position. And so when you put together stimulus dollars with a rapidly recovering labor market, which allowed people to go back to work and earn wages, all of a sudden, households and consumers are in great shape and they're able to spend money. And that's what they have been doing. And as a result, we've seen very high levels of demand. So both of these elements are very easy to see. If we look at the data, we can very clearly see the changes in the trends. So this shows you here employment trends in South Carolina and the recovery that we've seen since 2020, since the COVID recession, and also the recovery of employment following the Great Recession back in 2008. And I like to draw these two comparisons because it really illustrates the difference in the recovery rate that we saw in 2020 and since then compared to the recovery following the Great Recession in 2008. So you'll notice here, when we're looking at the COVID-19 recession in green, what we would call a V-shaped recovery pattern, a rapid decline in employment followed by rapid recovery. And it took us just about 2 years or so to recover all the jobs that were lost. So a very unusually fast recovery in terms of employment recovery from a recession. And today, we're about 4.7% above pre-recession employment levels. And you can also see how this contrasts very directly with the recovery process following the Great Recession in 2008, where it essentially took us 6 full years to recover all the employment losses incurred. So this just gives you some perspective on how quick this recovery actually was. People went back to work fast, they were able to earn incomes, and that was able to, that enabled consumer spending to be able to resume faster. Now, on the stimulus side, we also saw additional resources that were provided to households. And one way that we can specifically see this is looking at the personal savings of the US as a whole, US households. And again, going back before the pandemic, this graph goes back to 2018, you can see personal savings really spike beginning in 2020. And this was the result of the stimulus dollars, the 3 stimulus check payments that most Americans received. So you can see personal savings go up significantly for a period of just over a year. And then we start seeing these savings spent down. in 2021 and in 2022. And so one thing we can do then, given that consumers have been in a good financial position, they've been spending these savings, is to track it over time to see how personal savings have been going up and then how they began going down as consumers spent them. So you can think about just this accumulating, hopefully you can see my mouse here, just this accumulating additional savings up through May of 2021. And then beginning in the fall of 2021, they're spending down their savings. So what is the net effect of all this? Where are personal savings levels today in 2023? So when we do that calculation and just see how they've been accumulating versus spending them out, this is what we see. So this actually reflects excess personal savings for U.S. households as a whole. So beginning in 2020, you can see excess personal savings go up. So these are additional financial resources that households are accumulating. That peaks in 2021. Households begin to spend that down. And just in the last few months, have we actually gotten to the point that excess personal savings for the U.S. as a whole that it accumulated have now been exhausted. They've basically been spent. And this is very, very important, a very important metric, because it answers the question of how it's possible that we've had significant levels of consumer spending and stable spending over the past year, despite the fact that we've had inflation that's been at a 40-year high, right? Because normally we would expect that if you've got very high inflation, that's eroding the purchasing power. It makes things more expensive, erodes purchasing power for consumers. And so they're not going to be able to spend as much. And yet they have. Consumer spending has been consistent over the last year, despite high inflation. This answers that why. This answers how that's possible. Consumers have been drawing on these financial reserves that they had built up in 2020 and 21 and have been spending them down. But now, as of the spring, you can see that basically they've spent down all of these excess personal savings, which is going to impact how we think about the second half of 2023. So we'll come back and talk about that. But the bottom line here is you can see the real effects that the stimulus dollars have had on the financial well-being of households and consumers. In this transition, we can also see, as consumers have been spending down these excess financial reserves, consumer debt begin to go back up as well. And now debt as a percentage of overall disposable income is comparable to where we were before the recession began. And keep in mind, when we're looking at all of these metrics, keep in mind that theme in the back of your head of readjustment. The economy is readjusting to pre-pandemic norms. Consumer debt getting back to where we would normally expect it to be. And again, going back, excess personal savings being drawn down, getting back to the standard financial health of households that we normally would expect to see and that we had seen before the pandemic began. So this has had an effect on consumer spending. When we look at these two factors of a rapid labor market recovery, we see that combined with $6 trillion in stimulus. As a result, consumer spending recovered very quickly in 2020 and 2021. So you can clearly see the recession here, the effects of the COVID recession, followed by the rebound to consumer spending levels that basically are on par with what we were seeing before the pandemic began. In fact, if you were in 2016 or 2017 and you were to just use a trend line to project out where we would be for consumer spending levels in 2023, you would have done a pretty good job, right? Just doing a forecast based on a trend line. You can see here, very much in line with pre-pandemic norms. And that's been a good thing. That has allowed consumer spending, consumer spending, because it has bounced back so quickly, it allowed the economy to recover. And so that has been positive news overall. But having said that, looking at consumer spending as a whole is a bit misleading, because when we break it down into the goods market and the services market, we really get into a change in preferences that emerged beginning in 2020. So you can see that the goods market recovered far faster and saw effectively a bubble emerge in 2020 and 2021 at the expense of spending on the services market. Now, what's going on here? Well, in 2020 and 2021, remember that everybody was staying home. We all remember we were socially distanced. And so as a result, consumers were cutting back on in-person services. They weren't going to vacation. They weren't going out to eat. They were instead spending their money on goods and primarily durable goods. And that includes housing. So the housing, what I would call a mini housing bubble that basically emerged over the last 2 years, was basically just a subset or a part of this broader goods bubble that emerged because consumers were staying home. They were shifting their spending away from services and towards the goods market. And in addition to that, they had those excess financial reserves to tap into because of stimulus. So we see this goods bubble emerge throughout 2020 and 2021. And now over the last year, we've seen the pendulum begin to swing in the opposite direction. So now we're, again, readjusting, 2023 being the year of readjustment. We're seeing consumers now that are looking to spend on services. They're going out more. They are traveling again. And so we're seeing a pullback in spending on goods across the board in all markets, including housing. So this is one important element of the story of why we've seen a pullback in housing in 2023. Yes, a large part of it has to do to rising interest rates, but part of it also has to do to this broader shift in consumer preferences. So this is an important component as well, because this was a very unusual shift in consumer spending patterns that emerged following the pandemic. And we can even see how this affected different regions of South Carolina. So if we think about the goods market as driving the recovery, then it would make sense that regions of South Carolina that are primarily that primarily have industries that are in the goods sector, those are going to recover faster. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. So if we just look here at total employment gains since February of 2020, the regions of the state that have outpaced South Carolina's average, Charleston, Greenville, and Myrtle Beach, what do they have in common? What they have in common is that they have a strong housing market and also have a strong manufacturing base. So Myrtle Beach, most of the growth in Myrtle Beach has come from housing. Greenville, housing and construction, and Charleston, Greenville, housing and manufacturing, and Charleston, housing and manufacturing as well. So a lot of manufacturing both in Charleston and in the Greenville market. And the upstate more generally has the highest percentage of manufacturing in the state of South Carolina. So this goods and services, the change in preferences for spending among consumers explains why we're seeing certain areas of the state having recovered faster than others and where we're seeing the most growth overall, particularly in the last several years. So putting all this together, we can look at this demand and supply imbalance. And this is the best single visual that I think you will see that really encapsulates everything we've talked about so far and what the effects have been. Because remember, we said demand has been far outpacing supply across the board. And you can see that here, just comparing consumer spending levels, which are in green, to employment levels, which are in red. Now, this graph looks at the United States as a whole, but this looks at total growth, cumulative growth going back to 2020, both for consumer spending, which represents demand, as well as U.S. employment, which represents labor supply. And you can see a very significant difference here. Consumer spending is about 8% above where it was in February of 2020. Employment levels about 2.4% where they were. So that's about a 6 percentage point difference. So what this tells us is that even though the labor market has done well and has fully recovered all the lost jobs at the U.S. level, it just hasn't been enough to keep up with demand. It just hasn't been enough to keep up with demand. And that's why we've seen this imbalance. Those are the effects and the way we can see this imbalance. And that's why we've seen upward pressure on prices. Also keep in mind that when we look at these consumer spending data here, this reflects what we call real consumer spending, meaning inflation adjusted. So it's not that we're seeing 8% more consumer spending today because prices have gone up. This adjusts for inflation. So this just reflects the amount of goods and services, the amount of stuff in the economy that consumers are purchasing. So these are real changes in actual goods and services being purchased. So you can really see a difference between supply and demand here. Now, why does the supply and demand imbalance matter? We've already alluded to this. It matters because when you have demand that far outpaces supply, that leads to upward pressure on prices, which is the definition of higher inflation. And higher inflation, in turn, reduces purchasing power for consumers. It reduces the affordability of consumer goods, eventually leading to a pullback in consumer spending and economic activity. And this logic right here is exactly why the Fed has been laser focused on getting inflation down by raising interest rates. And we can very clearly see the effects of high inflation on South Carolina in the past 2 years just by comparing wage growth and inflation levels. So here you can see once again, a big difference between looking at the growth rate of average hourly earnings in South Carolina, which is 9.6%, and inflation, which has been 13%. Now, by the way, as an aside, nobody panic here. 13%, I want to be very clear, that represents 2 years worth of data. So we're comparing May of 2021 to May of 2023. So when you see 13% inflation, it is not that high for 1 year. But nevertheless, this does illustrate the broader point that over the past 2 years, we have seen inflation far outpace earnings growth, and that's led to an erosion of purchasing power. So these are the practical consequences of having high inflation in South Carolina that we've seen. And inflation affects everybody. It affects everybody when you go to the grocery store or when you're filling up with gasoline or ordering goods online. Inflation is something that affects all South Carolinians. So restoring supply and demand, very much the goal of the Federal Reserve. That's what they're laser focused on, and it is very much working. And we've seen meaningful progress throughout 2023. We can track inflation over time just to get a feel for where we are today compared to where we've been, particularly before the pandemic and in the last several years. Current inflation rates for the U.S. at 3% overall inflation. So a couple of numbers to use as a benchmark. So we can think about 3% inflation in terms of where we are now. That's the overall number for all goods and services over the last year. So when you read about inflation in the news and you see the top line number, that's the main number that you'll see where we are, 3%. That is far below 9.1% inflation, which is where we were last year at this time, or rather last year in June, which was at a 40-year high, but it is still elevated above the Fed's target rate of 2%. That's what the Fed is trying to get us to. So we're at 3%. We want to be at 2%, but we've seen significant improvement from 9.1% where we were this time last year. So that's the starting point for the inflation discussion. However, as we go from 3% to 2%, what's the Fed going to be looking at going forward to get us that last mile, right? To get us from 3% to 2%, because even though we've seen meaningful progress, we're not done yet. And the answer is we have to look at the drivers of inflation to understand what the Fed is going to be specifically targeting and what they're going to be monitoring most carefully, so that we can know what we need to be looking at as well. And so one way to see that is to look at what we call the core inflation rate, which is also graphed here. So you've got overall inflation, which is the economy as a whole, all goods and services. But then we can also have this other measure called core inflation, which throws out food and energy prices. And the reason we do that is because food and energy are notoriously volatile, and so they jump around all the time. And so throwing those out gives us a better indication of what the underlying inflation is for most other sectors of the economy that aren't as volatile when you get rid of food and energy. Because part of the reason inflation's come down over the last year is simply because oil prices have gone down. Gas prices have gone down by double digits, by about 16%. So that's important. That's good news for consumers. But what's the rest of the economy doing? Is it all just driven by energy prices? So those are the types of questions that we want to ask, and that's why it's important to look at the core inflation rate as well. And as you can see here, it has come down significantly, but still at 4.8%, still fairly elevated compared to where the Fed wants us at right around 2%. Drilling down further, we can also look at the divide between the goods market and the services market, like we did before with consumer spending. And this is where we really get some insight into what's driving our inflation right now. It's being driven by the services sector. It's being driven by the services sector. So here we break it down into durable goods and services. The 3% inflation rate, so the overarching inflation is the black line graphed here. But notice that the goods market has completely recovered in terms of inflation levels. So inflation is back down to where it was before the pandemic. So in the goods market overall, we've seen inflation come down. The Fed has done its job. But in the services sector, we're not quite there yet. Again, inflation's still elevated at close to or elevated above where above 3% and closer to 5%. And that's where we're still seeing a challenge. Part of the reason for that is that shift in consumer preferences away from spending on goods towards spending on services. So demand has been higher. And also because we have a labor shortage in the economy right now, and the service sector is more dependent on labor, that is putting upward pressure on wages. So you put those two things together and we get a services sector that is still seeing relatively high levels of inflation. And that's what's driving the remaining inflation in the economy right now that the Fed is still trying to get a handle on. So what have they done? They've been raising interest rates to help get this inflation down. Again, they've been doing, they've been able to get inflation down to 3% so far. And looking forward, we're actually in a fairly good position, both from the economy, looking at the economy as a whole, as well as looking at the housing market in particular, because most of these interest rate hikes are behind us. We have seen meaningful progress, and we've also seen a point now where the federal funds rate is now higher than the inflation rate, which you can see here. I like to say the streams have crossed when we look at interest rates and we look at inflation. So interest rates being higher than inflation basically means we have positive real interest rates now. So we're seeing that banks and households are more likely to earn positive returns on their money. And that's very important because historically speaking, we need positive interest rates in order to really get that last mile in inflation, to really get inflation down. So the fact that these lines have crossed is a very positive sign. The federal funds rate, interest rates are now higher than inflation. And you can see the importance of this very clearly if we look historically. So this is the same graph, but this just goes back to the 1970s, the last time we saw double-digit inflation levels. And what you can tell is that beginning in the 1980s, it was the early 1980s before the Fed funds rate, before interest rates got higher than inflation. And it was only once interest rates were higher than inflation for a significant period of time did we really begin to see demand recede and inflation come back down. So it takes these lines crossing, or the crossing the streams, a Ghostbusters analogy there. But it takes that crossing for inflation really to get down to the level where the Fed wants it. So this is a very positive sign. You can see this historically, and again, you can see we're moving in the right direction in terms of where we are as of the latest data that we have available here. All right, so now let's turn and talk more about the housing market and specifically what this implies for the second half of the year, because we've talked about how we got to this point, the disequilibrium in the economy between supply and demand, how 2023 is a period of readjustment that we are still in the process of, and how the Fed has been proactively raising rates to get inflation down. And so far, their strategy has been working, although there's still some work left to be done, particularly in the services sector. So where are these interest rate hikes having the largest impacts? And of course, as we all know, it's the housing market. There's no question that the housing market has really been on the front lines in this war against inflation, right? The Federal Reserve has been having to raise interest rates, and that's having a disproportionate effect on the housing market. Very clear in the data. There's no question about that. And so that begs the question of what we're likely to see going forward. So one way to think about this is to look at both the direct and what I'll call the direct and the indirect effects of interest rate hikes on the housing market. So we'll call the direct effects any reduction in sales activity, any pullback in demand that is simply the result of a decrease in affordability. So interest rates go up, that makes it harder to qualify for a mortgage. And so that is the definition of housing affordability, or a partial definition. It makes housing less affordable. And so we're seeing a decline in sales because housing is less affordable now because of these rising rates. That has happened in 2022. It has continued to happen into 2023. But the second potential effect going forward, and the one that we really need to keep our eye on, are these potential indirect effects, which really haven't hit us yet, and they may not hit us. And that's any subsequent reduction in housing demand that comes about from increases in unemployment. Because remember, the single best predictor that we have for housing demand is employment growth. When we look at all metrics across the board, that is the single most predictive factor. And so it is very important to monitor changes in the labor market, changes in employment over time. And right now, the labor market remains strong. But if we were to see a recession because of these high interest rates, and that recession were to lead to an uptick in unemployment, that could potentially affect housing sales as well. So that's where we would potentially see a further pullback. So we've got direct effects and we have indirect effects that we need to be looking at. Direct effects have already happened and are occurring now. Indirect effects have not and may not, but these are going to be indicators that we need to be watching for in the second half of the year. Now, we can see this very clearly when we look at the data that show us the causes and consequences of both areas here. We can look at mortgage interest rates. Of course, we're all familiar with the basically the doubling of mortgage interest rates that has occurred over the last year to year and a half as a result of the Federal Reserve's actions, currently right around 6.7%. These are monthly averages, by the way, so these may not be the numbers that you see active today. But in general, you can see the trend in terms of what's happened over the last year and a half or so. Interest rates have effectively doubled. And that has had a dramatic effect on markets. We go back to employment growth. And before, remember, we were looking at the recovery overall by region going back to February of 2020. Here, we're just looking at employment growth by industry in 2023. So far this year, which industries have seen the most growth? And once again, you can see this significant divide between the goods market and the services market, right? It's very, very clear. So the bars in green represent services, and the bars in red represent the goods market: construction, manufacturing, and trade, transportation, and utilities. Most of that is retail and wholesale trade. So again, the purchases of the sale and purchase of consumer goods. So where are we seeing these interest rate hikes having the biggest effect? Clearly, it's in the goods market, particularly for high ticket items like housing, people buying cars, people looking to buy furniture. So any big ticket item is going to be affected because it's less affordable when you're raising interest rates and people have to borrow money in order to afford these items. So in general, the goods market has been most affected by interest rates, by rising interest rates, and the housing market especially so. And we can see this looking locally and nationally. So this summarizes South Carolina housing sales data going back to 2016. And you can really see this, essentially this mini bubble that had emerged throughout 2020 and 2021, and the pullback that we've seen in 2022 and 2023. Now, another element of this that's important to keep in mind, yes, we have seen a major pullback over the last year, but when we put a long-term perspective on it, notice here, so if we just introduce a comparison point to look at where we are today compared to where we were before the pandemic, you'll notice that sales are still very much in line with pre-pandemic norms, right? So we've seen an adjustment, we've seen a readjustment. Again, that's the theme for 2023, but that's very different from looking at a longer term perspective, which shows that we've effectively been in a mini housing bubble because of the excess demand due to federal stimulus and due to a rapidly recovering labor market. And now we're beginning to readjust to pre-pandemic norms. Another way that we can see this, in addition to just graphically here, is we can look at the specific numbers. And so you can see how misleading it can be to say that total sales declined by double digits over the last year, even though that's 100% true. We saw a decline from 2022 to 2023 of about 13%. But just comparing data over the long term, again, looking at June total sales, and in this case, looking back to 2016, we're still seeing sales levels in June in this example that are up by close to 16% compared to 2019, and generally either up or compatible with June levels before the pandemic. So we're still seeing positive growth, and we've averaged positive growth from 2019 to 2023. It's just that over the last year, we are readjusting. We are moving back towards pre-pandemic norms because demand is readjusting, because people are spending down, or people have exhausted their savings, because they're shifting back towards the spending of away from goods and towards services. So going through this readjustment and this market correction gets us back to pre-pandemic norms, but that's very different from the perspective of just looking over the last year. So it's important to keep in perspective, particularly when we're looking at these year-over-year numbers. And we can also see a similar trend if we look nationally. So those are state level data, but we get a similar picture when we look at national numbers. And really any data on housing sales, if you track it over time, you're going to see a very similar picture, basically a mini bubble that emerged following the onset of the pandemic that led to unusually high and unsustainably high levels of demand. And that's now receding back to pre-pandemic norms. And again, looking here for U.S. new single family housing sales, that's exactly what we see. So same basic picture, same basic trend that we're seeing at the state level. Housing demand overall, sales levels doing fairly well and comparable to what we were seeing before the pandemic, but clearly not nearly as strong as we saw in 2022 and in 2021. Now, on the pricing side, the story is a little bit different. We can also compare how house prices have been changing. We continue to see positive growth in the median sales price in South Carolina, despite the fact that we've seen a pullback in demand. The pre-pandemic average was around 6% for annual sales price growth, and that's dropped now to around 2%, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen there, but still appreciating, still moving up, or rather still increasing. So despite the fact that we've seen double-digit declines in demand over the last year in terms of sales, housing prices continue to rise. And that's because of one factor we haven't addressed yet, which is a lack of inventory, which is still very much with us in South Carolina and across the US, and is likely to continue to be a challenge, certainly for the rest of 2023 and probably into 2024 as well. So this lack of inventory is going to continue to be a factor driving changes in housing market trends, particularly this relationship between sales, which have pulled back significantly over the last year, and price changes, which are still moving in a positive direction or moving up, but not nearly as much so as they were last year. Two reasons for this. One reason is because of the broader inventory constraints that have developed over the past decade. So one of the things that we've seen in the past, since the Great Recession back in 2008, is a consistent period of a lack of new construction. So we've seen a decade-long period of underbuilding. And that is one reason why we continue to see these inventory shortages into 2023. And this is very clear when we look at population growth in South Carolina and just compare that, do a straight comparison to permit growth. So population growth has been consistent. Again, that black line there, very stable over time. But you can see the blue bars representing permit growth, which dropped off following the 2008 recession as many builders went bankrupt. Others were much more skittish about entering the market because of low demand. Many were skittish because of new regulations that were implemented following the Great Recession. So the bottom line is that we had a decade-long period of underbuilding, despite the fact that demand was continuing to grow consistently as evidenced by this population growth. So we have a lack of inventory now for new housing. And then for existing housing, we're also seeing inventory constraints in 2023 because fewer people are looking to buy as mortgage interest rates have risen. And this is especially a factor for people who have bought recently. So if they have a 3 or 4% mortgage rate, then they may be less likely to buy if they're going to have to get a 6 or 7% mortgage interest rate in 2023. So they would need much more of a motivation to buy than they would if interest rates were more comparable. So we've got multiple factors at play here, but the end result is the same, which is that we have a significant lack of inventory, and that's going to continue to put upward pressure on prices throughout the second half of 2023 and likely into 2024. So what other adjustments then can we look at as well for the housing market? What can we expect going forward? Well, a couple of other concluding comments that I want to leave you with, metrics that we need to be watching. Number one is that the Fed is still walking the tightrope. Number one is to make that point. They're still attempting to lower inflation without causing a recession. So far, we've seen some success there, but they still have a ways to go. And so what we know about the Fed going forward, in addition to the fact that getting inflation under control is being their highest priority, is that most of the Fed's planned interest rate hikes are behind us. I mentioned this before. Most have already been implemented. We're probably only going to see 1 or possibly 2 more rate increases before the end of 2023. And so from the housing market's perspective, especially, that's good news, because that, again, suggests that most of the interest rate policies have already been implemented. And we've seen a majority of the effect on mortgage interest rates already. So with that in mind, what are the ingredients for more housing market stability in the coming months? Now that we've corrected and we've seen housing demand basically move back to levels that are comparable to where we were before the pandemic, we've largely readjusted. Are we going to see more of a pullback, or are we going to stabilize where we are? And I think the answer is that we're far more likely to stabilize where we are, especially if we see the following ingredients met for stability in the coming months for the rest of 2023. One is a minimal number of additional rate hikes, which is likely. That's what the Fed is saying that they are anticipating. Second is stable consumer spending. And third is a strong labor market. If we see all three of these things happen, then we're likely to see the housing market stabilize at its current level and then begin to grow again at pre-pandemic norms from our new baseline from where we are. Because remember, that mini bubble that we've seen over the last 2 years was not sustainable. Now, we've said that point number one, minimal additional rate hikes, that's likely to occur based on the Fed statements. What about consumer spending and the labor market? Well, on the consumer spending front, things are looking stable, and the U.S. economy in general has been very resilient throughout 2023 in handling and absorbing these higher interest rates. So we see consumer spending growth very consistent. Again, it settled down in early 2022 following the high volatility in 2020 and 2021, but no real sign of consumer spending pulling back in a significant way, which is important for our economy as a whole, because consumer spending represents about 70% of US GDP, 70% of US GDP. So consumer spending is important it's important for us to see consumer spending growing consistently. And right now that continues to remain fairly strong overall. If we look at the subset of consumer spending that is US retail sales, again, that's been fairly stable as well. Some pullback in terms of monthly growth rates, but still overall positive. And remember, the Fed is looking to slow demand. So it's not that we don't want to see a slowing economy at all, because we need to see some pullback in demand in order for inflation to continue to recede. But we don't want to see a recession. So again, walking that fine line, walking that tightrope. And that's what we're seeing here. Perhaps a slight pullback in retail sales, but still positive growth moving in the right direction. And then when we look at the labor market, we see exactly the same thing. In South Carolina, total employment levels in South Carolina still moving in a positive direction. We're still gaining jobs, though again, not at the same rate in 2022 and 23 that we saw during the earlier recovery period from the pandemic in 2021 and the early part of 2022. So it's very clear that the Fed's rate hikes have had an effect in terms of slowing the economy, but not slowing it so much that we're actually going into recession. So the labor market is looking strong from the perspective of the number of jobs being added. If we look at the job openings rate itself, we also see very stable markets. Again, a slowing, a readjusting, but still in a position where we're seeing growth. So the US job openings rate still relatively high compared to where we were before the pandemic began. And remember, the job openings rate reflects the total number of jobs that are currently available and unfilled. So this is basically a way of measuring the number of help wanted signs hanging in the windows, right? Just how many jobs are available and are not currently filled. And so this is still very much elevated, although it has come down from its peak back in mid-2022. Again, we can see this economy that is slowing, a slowing that began in 2022, but still growing and still growing in a positive direction overall. And then finally, the most important metric for the labor market that I would urge you all to keep your eye on, which is initial unemployment insurance claims data. So anytime an individual in South Carolina is laid off from their job, they have the option to file for unemployment insurance. And when they do, the first week that they file, they're considered an initial claimant. So the number of initial unemployment insurance claims gives us a good indicator of new layoffs in South Carolina as a whole. And that's important because there's no other way that we can really see what's going on with small and medium-sized businesses. If a large manufacturer, for example, lays off let's say 500 or 1,000 workers, that's going to be front page news. We're going to hear about it. But if you see a lot of small layoffs among smaller and medium-sized companies, we don't typically see that in the news. And looking at initial unemployment insurance claims data gives us some insight into what those smaller businesses are doing, because small businesses represent the bulk of the state's economy. And so as you can see here, unemployment insurance claims are very much in line with the average level that they were at before the pandemic began. So again, another good sign that the labor market continues to remain resilient and strong. So wrapping up then, when we put all this together, I want to leave you on a note that really paints a positive picture that we are more likely to be able to achieve the soft landing that the Fed wants to or is targeting and is trying to get us to. And that's and the way to see this is by thinking about this race between inflation and checking account balances. So before, remember, we talked about consumers were were spending down their savings, the excess savings they had accumulated, in order to keep their spending levels stable, given the fact that inflation was rising. They want to spend the same amount, or rather they want to buy the same amount of goods and services, but it's costing them more. So they're having to draw down these excess financial reserves in order to keep spending at their current levels. And so as inflation comes down and those excess financial reserves come down, it's important that we get inflation down first, because if we don't, if all the financial reserves are exhausted and inflation's still high, now all of a sudden consumers and households, now they're going to run out of funds and they're going to have to start cutting back, and that could potentially lead to recession. So that's the race that we're looking at. So who's winning the race? Because I already alluded to the fact that consumers are exhausting those financial reserves. We already saw that. But the good news is inflation has actually now dropped below the average hourly earnings growth rate in South Carolina for the first time beginning in April of 2023. So this gives us a very optimistic sign for the second half of the year that inflation is now to the point where it's not eroding purchasing power, at least not as much as it has been, because wage growth is now once again outpacing inflation, which means that consumers are more likely to be able to continue to spend at their current levels than now that their financial reserves are back down to pre-pandemic norms. So this is a very positive sign going forward. Now, it just started. So again, the effects of inflation have still been significant across the economy for consumers and for households. Don't want to imply that that hasn't been a significant effect, but I will say that this is a major turning point that we've seen in the last few months, in terms of now, once again, crossing these lines where we see average hourly earnings growth now higher than, or wage growth now higher than inflation for the first time in almost, or rather right at 2 years as a whole. So the bottom line, as we look forward to the second half of the year, South Carolina very much rebounded from the recession of 2020, still in a very strong position, and has been very resilient with respect to these interest rate hikes. Economic growth and the labor market are still very much in good shape and are very strong. Inflation, still the biggest short-run economic threat to the U.S. and to South Carolina. We're down to 3%, but this last mile, getting us down to 2%, is going to be a challenge because of the inflation embedded in the service sector. So the Fed still has a bit of work to do. So we need to be monitoring the service sector going forward. And the Fed is going to continue to be laser focused on getting inflation down to 2%. So the potential for the Fed to overshoot is still there. And that is what could potentially put us into a mild recession. But having said that, I think we're in a far better position now than we were 6 months ago. It's less likely that we're going to see a recession within the next year. And further pullback in housing demand only likely really if the labor market weakens and we begin to see an uptick in unemployment. Because what we've seen so far is largely a correction, a movement away from that mini bubble that emerged, that unsustainably high demand. And we've seen most of the interest rate hikes now implemented. So further rate hikes should be fairly minimal. So I think only any further reduction in the housing market in terms of demand is likely only if we see an uptick in unemployment. But because we have such a prevalent labor shortage, and because we are now seeing wage growth that is once again outpacing inflation, I think that's less likely to happen. Certainly less likely than it was 6 months ago. So I'm more optimistic about the second half of the year than certainly I was, and most economists were going into 2023 back in December. So I will stop there. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm going to turn it back over to Nick and stop sharing my screen. And I'll be happy to take any questions in the time we have left.
Thank you, Dr. Von Nessen. That was a great presentation. We've gotten lots of great feedback in the chat. Thank you for your time and I know the energy and the research that you put into this. And it certainly is uplifting to hear some of the data, because I was kind of in the same boat with you. I think at the beginning of the year I had a little bit more concerns, and it certainly seems to continue to improve. So we got a couple of questions here. Let's start with John from Charleston. He's seeing locally banks that as a result of the failures and some of the skittishness that we had early in the year are not lending to smaller businesses and making these smaller businesses have to resort to higher interest loans or possibly not even be able to get a loan. Do you see that those banking conditions improving in the near future?
I think they're likely to stable. I think they will improve and stabilize as we move forward, because one of the things that we saw back in the spring was essentially a very targeted area where we saw certain high risk industries that were basically exposed, and which caused some of this lending crisis. But it was not widespread in the financial sector overall. It was very targeted there in crypto and other, again, very risky assets. So because of that, I think that the financial sector, we've seen more stability because we've seen more evidence that yes, it was very much targeted in those sectors. It was not permeating most of the industry. So we should see more stability going forward. And the question is how quickly that recovers. And I think that's just still to be determined.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Nessen. Benjamin asks an interesting question. We've seen a lot of news cycles recently about student loans and the administration's attempt to erase some of that student debt. Courts have weighed in. how do you think repayment of student loans will affect not only consumer spending, but home buying in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we do know that there's a lot of research that shows that that student loan debt is a conflict with buying a new home for young people in many cases. In other words, taking on more debt does make it more challenging in many cases to buy a new home. But having said that, from an economic perspective, when we do see we are looking to get demand down. Again, we're trying to rebalance the economy. And so I think one of the things that was occurring over the last several years by student loan debt basically on pause is that did free up additional spending, and that contributed to higher demand and partially kept inflation elevated. So from that perspective, this is more of once again, a readjustment back to pre-pandemic norms, and puts us in a position where we're going to continue to see demand on the margin pull back, which is going to help us get inflation down. So I think from the perspective of the Fed, if your number one goal is to get inflation down, then this could be seen as a positive development. But certainly that limits financial resources and where are individuals going to pull the money from, and they're going to be less likely to buy a house. So we've got trade-offs here that we're observing.
Thank you. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions. Stephanie asked a question that was on my mind, Joy. We continue to struggle with inventory. You've highlighted that again today. Stephanie asked, what are the chances that we will overbuild and end up with too much supply like we were in 2006? I think we're years away from that situation. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with that. I don't think overbuilding is going to be a problem anytime soon. And now the big caveat there is it depends on the market. So I think every market is going to be different. But certainly when you look at areas of high demand, which is much of South Carolina and particularly markets like Charleston, I think there's such a lack of inventory now. I think we're years away from that being a challenge. I think the greater challenge for the economy and for the housing market too is going to be this labor shortage going forward, and that affects the ability for builders to be able to, that's going to affect their time frame as it does for most sectors. So I think that's a much more short run factor that's going to affect growth and housing demand, as well as other factors as well. But just in terms of when do we get back to inventory levels that are comparable to where we were before the pandemic, or really before, let's say, 2015. Yeah, I think years away is an appropriate way to think about it.
Okay. We've got time for a couple more questions here. One issue that has been keeping me awake at night, Joy, is the issue of property insurance. And Sandra asks what the impact of insurance will have on coastal property sales. And we saw, again, another major insurer pull out of the marketplace. Farmers announced that they were no longer writing new policies in Florida, and we've seen State Farm and others do the same. And it's in our coastal markets, we are seeing extraordinary increases in property insurance premiums. Is definitely something we need to add on the watch list for future factors. But do you have any initial thoughts on that?
I think that's going to be something that continues to develop. I don't think we really know what the outcome is going to be yet, where that's going to stabilize, because it's such its infancy right now. But I think that is definitely going to be an issue that continues to grow over time, and we'll just have to see how different markets respond. But I think we're just at the beginning of this trend. Now, on the flip side, though, one of the things that we have seen is that demand in coastal markets has remained extraordinarily high. So the real question is, how high would insurance rates or lack of insurance, where would the tipping point be where we'd see a meaningful impact on demand? I think that's the main question, which we really don't have an answer to yet, because in coastal markets, people want to be there. I mean, there's no question about that. People are moving in, and you look at the southeastern region of the United States more generally, more people are projected to move to this area of the country than any other over the next 2 decades. So we're going to continue to see high demand. And is there going to be a tipping point, or is this just going to be a marginal cost increase? What does that look like? And again, I think we're just too early to tell.
Thank you. We've had some questions about over/under predictions for upcoming Gamecock season, but we'll pass on those for now. I will remind everyone that South Carolina has had the Palmetto Series trophy for the last 5 years in a row, just in case anyone was wondering. But let's end with this question. This has been in the headlines the last couple of weeks as well, regarding commercial properties and the remote work phenomena that's created lots of empty space and vacancy rates, and maybe not so much in South Carolina, but how is that going to affect these properties if they go in default? If they is that an opportunity to flip these properties into some housing opportunities, which I've seen as proposals? But overall, how do you see this work from home phenomenon impacting the economy over the next couple of years?
So that's a great question, because we're still seeing that transition, and so we're still in the process. But I think what the data show very clearly so far, number one, is that work from home is becoming, again, these are averages overall. We're looking at more of a hybrid model. So that's number one. I think if you look at the average job, we're looking at commuting maybe 2 days a week instead of 5. And so what we're seeing is that more people are moving towards moving into the suburbs, away from these larger cities, but they still, so they have more flexibility because they're not going in as often, but they're not necessarily relocating hundreds of miles away, because they are having to go in periodically. So this hybrid model that's emerging. So you've seen a lot of growth in suburbs away from the major metropolitan regions, and I think that's likely to be a new equilibrium going forward. So what does that imply for a lot of the office space downtown or in these major cities? Again, I think, Nick, what you alluded to is a possibility. We don't really have any specific trends in terms of norms that have emerged as a result. But I think one thing that's very clear is that we've seen a lot of growth in the suburbs as the hybrid work schedule has become really the new norm. So work from home is part of it, but it's not as much of a 100% work from home environment, I think, as we would have anticipated maybe 12 to 18 months ago.
Yeah, it continues to evolve for sure. Well, realtors, we are a little bit past our time. I am sorry that we're not able to get to all of your questions. We had over 200 members from start to finish on this wonderful presentation. Dr. Joy Von Nessen, thank you for your work, and thank you for your presentation today. On behalf of all of our 29,000 realtors across the state, thank you for the insights and the viewpoint that you bring to the table for us. It helps. We are not economists. It's hard to take these numbers and make sense of them, and putting them together in a way that helps us address our business, look at future modeling in our various markets is critical to our business. So thank you again. Thank you to all the realtors that participated. We will have this presentation. Mike will have it later on our various channels on YouTube as well, our YouTube channel. Check that out. And make sure you subscribe so updates always get pushed out to you. And we'll also have a link to the slides in next week's weekly member email that we send out as well. So in the meantime, again, Dr. Joy Von Nessen, thank you. Realtors, thank you. Have a great week. Stay safe, stay realtor strong, and we'll catch you again next time. Take care, everybody.